Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Today we are going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors on this 2007 Toyota Highlander. This will be the same for the 2001 to 2007 year models. I'm going to give you a ton of information. I'm going to give you a ton of tips, the torque specifications, grease to use. I'm going to do a ton of stuff. I'm going to speed up the process where I can and if I can. So while you're watching, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share. And I'm going to give you a ton of info. So sit back, get a notepad. I like to use a lug nut to hold the rotor in place while I am disassembling everything, as well as reassembling. When I put the rotor on, the new rotor, I like to use a lug nut to hold it on. This makes it so either disassembly or reassembly, it doesn't flop around. That rotor just stays put, so you're not having everything move. Since both wheels are off the ground, I've got the jack stands under there. I'm on the other side of the vehicle turning the caliper out so we have more room to access the bolts we need to get to that are holding the caliper and the bracket on the vehicle. This job is really easy. It's super simple. It doesn't take many tools. It doesn't take really much knowledge. And I'm going to give you all of the know-how or all of the knowledge that you're going to need to get this job done in the video. So make sure you're staying tuned. At first, I like to make sure I get a good look at what I'm going to be touching. These two top bolts are going to need to be removed. You have the caliper bracket and the caliper bolt itself. Both are going to be removed. And when we do install them later on, there will be torque specifications I'll give you while we do the installation process too. Here on the bottom of the caliper and bracket, same thing. You have a bolt on the caliper, you have a bolt on the bracket. Take them right off. The rotor is going to come right off pretty much. Now I'll get you a second view so you have a nice view of everything. I'm using a 14 millimeter 6-point socket on a 3/8 drive ratchet to remove these caliper bolts. They shouldn't be too hard to get off. The torque specification on these are really light. Not too many vehicles have a high torque spec on these. I just did an Acura MDX and the video's coming out soon on that one. And that one actually, it was like 55 foot-pounds or something like that on this little bolt. I was very surprised. So back to this one. If you don't have a torque wrench, a lot of people, they do them. I don't recommend it. I always recommend if you have a torque wrench, use them. If you don't have a torque wrench, look for a link in the link. Look for a link in the description below to purchase one. And if you're going to do this job in your driveway or at home, to do this video, it took me about an hour to do the video, and that's just one side. If I wasn't making the video trying to get the shots, making sure I have enough lighting and all that, this job could be done both sides within the hour if you have the know-how, all the tools, and all the consumables ready to go. When you get these bolts off, set them off to the side. What I've been liking to do lately is, like here, when I remove the caliper, I'll put the bolts back into the sliders so I know where they're at and I don't lose them. Before we go too far, we need to remove the cap off of the brake fluid reservoir. This will allow fluid to drain out of your reservoir right there, rather than blow a seal or a gasket when we are compressing the caliper piston back into the caliper, which we're going to do now. I'm going to be using a really cheap caliper compressor, one I picked up, I think it was at like a O'Reilly's or AutoZone, one of the parts stores around here. $12.95 it was, like 10 years ago. I'm still using it, so bang for your buck. There you go. There's a lot of fancier ones out there, but this one works just fine for a lot of the brake jobs I do. Again, link in the description below to purchase if you need it. We're going to speed this up a little bit. This part right here takes about not even 10 minutes or so, and I don't use too much effort or oomph to compress this piston. It does look kind of hard. I don't know if it does or not, but I'm really strong. So press the piston all the way into the caliper as far as it will go. This brake pad is an old brake pad that I use, so I don't ruin a new one, and I'm going to push all the way in. That brake pad should be flush with the housing of that caliper. And now you don't want to let the caliper hang on the hose. Hook or tie the caliper up on the strut assembly or on the spring right here. I usually have a bungee cord I use to strap it in place so it doesn't fall off, but this one seemed to be pretty secure, so I didn't want to worry about it too much, and I was kind of in a hurry. It's dark outside. Even though lighting is good, it is pretty damn dark and we need to get going. I'm using a 1/2-inch breaker bar to remove the caliper bracket bolt. This is going to be a 17 millimeter. 1/2-inch breaker bar. You could probably use a 1/2-inch socket wrench. This one's not torqued down too much, so you probably won't damage your your socket wrench if you do use one. You can see since it's loose, I went over to a 3/8 socket wrench. This one goes pretty quick. I really like this wrench. It's got a rubber coating on it, so if I hit myself with it, it doesn't hurt too bad. Knuckle busters aren't as bad as a nice solid. Now with both bolts off of the caliper bracket, set them off to the side, somewhere you're not going to lose them. You're not going to kick them down the driveway or whatnot. And get ready to rebuild or refurbish, I guess you could say, the caliper bracket. The hardware kit that you should have got with your brakes. And let's make sure we have everything before we go too far. And I would really recommend you check all this before you actually start your brake job so you know everything's right. Obviously the brake pad kit, this is a Z16 box, but I actually got a Z17 kit, which includes the pads, a hardware kit, which is the shims and the silencers, and also the wear indicator. This kit also includes the boots, the slider boots with a little bit of grease, but I like to use my own grease. Obviously the rotors slotted and ported, and they are directional with little stickers on them. So when you put the rotor on, you know which one goes where. We are going to be replacing the slider boots, the silencer shims, or the anti-squeal shims. But we're going to make sure we do a really good job cleaning out these ports that the sliders go in. We were having a problem, or the customer was having a problem with the brakes sticking, and so it wasn't releasing the caliper properly. So what we did, we made sure we cleaned everything out. We got all that old gunk out of there, made sure that these new sliders slid in and out just fine, and everything ended up being fixed. So that was the problem, that these things were just full of gunk. Whoever did the brakes last either didn't put new lube in there or they used the wrong lube. And I could say we put probably 40,000 miles at least on this vehicle since we made this video, and we haven't had any problems. And the upgrade to the slotted and drilled rotors, that's a huge change too. I love these power stop rotors. I think all of our vehicles have them. This was our new vehicle that we got as a commuter for my wife, and it works out really good. So Highlander, I really recommend them. When you are getting everything reassembled, you want to make sure that these sliders freely slide in and out, both of them. I'm going to speed up the process on this second side a lot and just get to the end. This one actually was a little bit different because it has the little rubber grommet at the end of your slider, but it is the same thing. Take everything apart, clean it all up, reassemble it, and just make sure everything slides freely. If anything feels like it has any friction or it doesn't want to move, take it apart, clean it up, and start over again. You don't want to have anything hampering movement, especially when it comes to braking. This kit was pretty nice. It included everything we needed. The little grommet that goes on the bottom of the slider, the boots, the anti-squeal shims, or the brake pad supports, whatever you want to call them. This grease right here is a disc brake. I believe it is a synthetic disc brake grease. I've used it for a few years, never had any problems. I never had any of this grease gunk up on me and cause the sliders not to move. And I only use grease on the sliders. I don't use them on the back of the pads or on the side of the pads, only on the sliders, and that's it. Get all the excess grease wiped up. Just make sure everything moves freely. You don't want any grease to fall off when everything warms up, and the grease might drip off. So just make sure it's nice and clean before you go too far. Now we're going to replace the hardware, or the anti-squeal shims, or the brake pad support shims, depending on what you want to call them. Just make sure that when you buy your brake pads, they have a hardware kit that includes these shims or pieces of hardware. I always replace them for every brake job that I'm doing, unless somebody's supplying the parts and I'm just doing a pad slap or something like that. But whenever I purchase parts for a customer or recommend purchasing a part, I always recommend you get a hardware kit. And if they have a boot kit, you might as well get those while we're here. There's no extra charge, and just, hey, do it all at once. When you put these shims on, or silencers, you don't want to put any grease on them. In the past, I used to put grease right here, so I thought what was happening was that it would make the pads move easier in and out off of the rotor, but I got knowledge and looked into it too, and sure as heck, when the grease gets hot, it's either going to drip onto the pad or onto the rotor, cause it not to work efficiently, and also it'll build up debris. You can see right there, that is the wear indicator. And I put it on the pad right here. Later on in the video, you're going to see how important it is to take note of where parts are when you remove everything. That's why I always recommend take pictures of every step of the process when you were doing it yourself. Here I went in and checked all data, make sure we had the proper brake specifications. That's how I get my torque specs on most of my vehicles, is all data. So this one said the caliper bracket itself is going to be a 17 millimeter and 79 foot-pounds, and the caliper bolt will be a 14 millimeter at 25 foot-pounds. This new rotor, the power stop drilled and slotted rotor, it comes labeled on which side or the location of the rotor should be. Make sure before you put your rotor on, take a look at your hub. If there's any rust right there, wipe that off. Maybe use emery cloth or something like that. Just make sure that it has a nice flat surface on the hub for the rotor to meet. I like to use the lug nut when I'm assembling or disassembling, like I said before. This makes it so the rotor doesn't move around or flop around when you're trying to install the caliper. It surprisingly makes the jobs much faster and easier, especially when you're doing a lot. I do it every single time. Grab your caliper bracket with your new shims all lubed up, ready to go. These 17 millimeter bolts, I like to tighten up with a 6-point half-inch socket wrench or a 3/8 just to tighten them down to German torque specs of Gudentight. I would not tighten these bolts down with this 3/8 alone. If I didn't have a torque wrench, I would at least use a half-inch socket wrench or a breaker bar to get these nice and tight. When we do tighten them down, I am going to use a half-inch torque wrench, and we're going to torque them down to 79 foot-pounds. I like to make sure my shims don't rub on the rotor. If it looks like I have any type of rubbage or it looks like it's going to be a problem later, I like to use something flat like a wedge or, in this situation, a flathead screwdriver, and just push everything off of the rotor. Make sure nothing is going to touch. It's properly seated into the caliper bracket, and just take your time.
17.
Look at everything before you go. Again, 79 foot-pounds, 17 millimeter 6-point socket, half-inch torque wrench. Gets the caliper bracket tightened down. Next, we're going to have the caliper bolt or caliper bolts. But before that, you could see, I said, the importance of taking note of where everything went. I tried to install this pad, and I'm like, what the heck, it won't go in properly. But if you noticed, I moved the wear indicator. On this vehicle, the wear indicator is on the inboard pad on the upper side. So on the inside brake pad, on the top side of that brake pad. So I had to change it, put it in the right location, and then everything fit just fine. I was going to make a little episode of not getting that pad in properly, but it was just a waste of time on this already 17-minute video. So I try to sped it up as much as I can. Now we're getting the caliper bracket tightened up. Again, 14 millimeter, 25 foot-pounds. Now that we're getting everything tightened up, you're torquing down the bolts for the caliper. We're all done, right? You're not. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. If you were going to do a brake job like this at home, the parts that I used in this kit for this video cost about 200 bucks. And you're saving yourself about $150 to $200 in labor by doing this at home rather than at a shop. So you might save yourself a couple $100 with the knowledge that you're gaining in this video. Now I turn the wheel straight, it makes it easier to put the wheel on. And how often do your brakes go bad? Your initial brakes from the factory for some reason go bad about 80,000 miles, and you should get about 60,000-ish out of your aftermarket brakes. For some reason they don't last as long. So before we go too far, we're not done with the brake job. Remember, we got to pump the brake pedal before you go anywhere, or you're not going to have brakes. You'll be like, what the heck is happening? I have no brakes. This is why. So make sure you pump the brakes. Before you put the cap on the reservoir, pump the brakes. Usually 3 to 5 pumps get you a nice firm pedal. Sometimes it takes more, but pump them. The reservoir should be up to the full line. Make sure the cap is nice and tight so you don't spill anything out while you're driving. And now you're pretty much done. You could sit back, take the wheel back off, and admire your job. This job should take you about an hour, hopefully about less than an hour and a half to get everything done. If this video did help you out, make sure you comment below. Like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about me. I really appreciate everybody taking the time to watch my video. I really hoped it helped you get the knowledge that you needed to get your job completed. when you start taking care of your ride and maintaining it yourself, you gain so much pride in your ride. So comment below, let me know what helped you out. Check out my other videos. I'll see you on the next hopefully helpful video. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies.